The next section we're going to work on is the slider section, or this featured content area right here. And in order to set that up, we need to pull a few images from the web. Now I've just browsed flickr.com for some Creative Commons images, and I came across James the First, user James the First, and he has some really great images of some landscape scenes, and I've pulled a couple of these off to use for the demonstration purposes, but you'll need to find a few of your own images to use in your featured content slider. So what I've done is I've downloaded 4 or 5 of these images to my desktop and imported those into Photoshop. And you can see here I have each of these layers has one of those images inside of the area. So you'll just need to pull these into Photoshop yourself and place them. Once you have them downloaded, you can simply say File, Place, choose the image from your desktop and place those into Photoshop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to group each one of these images into a folder. So I have all, you can see layer 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm going to take all of those and group those, and I'm just going to call this group featured images. Now once I have these featured images, I know that they need to go inside of my featured slider area right here. So the next spot is going to be to flesh out this area and add a little bit of design to make it look like it has somewhat of a page curl. Now I've just noticed an error in my Photoshop document when I brought in these featured images. These featured images I had sized to the size of my previous document already, and you can see that they're actually shorter, or the width of them is less than the width of my current document. And I've discovered a problem in my document. If I go back to my other document, the one that the ending design file, if you recall, I measured this and it was about 1040 pixels wide, which it is. And if we measure my document here, the width of my new document, it is currently 1120 pixels. And so the error I made is when I was designing this file, you get recording away and you forget to count the columns. I actually had an extra column on each side when I did the guide layer, and I forgot to count, and I just assumed that it was the correct number of columns, and so I just built my grid right according to my columns, but I didn't actually count the columns because I just duplicated them away. So rather than going back and fixing that error, I like to leave errors in my video rather than editing them out, because it oftentimes it helps. You can kind of see how you can correct some errors. So I'm going to fix this error and resize these columns so they're at the correct size they need to be. And so I need to take off one of these columns. I have one too many columns. So what I can do is I'll just open up here my wireframe block layer, and I need to essentially take in an entire side all the way over one column. So I'll highlight all of these layers. Let's take in, we'll start with the background, the featured layer, and the sidebar layer, and we can free transform that and pull this all in one column. Now it's probably going to help if I make sure I have my snapping turned on. So I'm going to cancel that, make sure because I believe I turned it off. I did. So I'll turn snapping back on. I'll zoom in here and I'll turn my guides back on, and I'm going to pull out a guide and drop it right at that center point. Now it's not snapping to the center there because I don't have my grid turned on. So I'm going to undo that and turn on my grid as well so that I can snap right to that center point there, and pull out a guide and drop it right there. All right, so essentially my entire layout needs to come in and click to that layer. So we'll come back here, I'll select those layers again, the background, hold down Shift, the featured area, the sidebar. And whoops, don't hold down Shift, we actually need to hold down Command because I don't want to select them all. I want to hold down Command and select those 3 without the content and free transform that, and then bring all of those back. You can notice it clicks right into place right there. So that will solve that problem. And then I need to also fix my content area and free transform it, and it as well needs to come back one column. So I'll need to take this column, it should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 again. So I'll have to take this and move it over right in between there. That's my gutter space right there, that lighter gray color. And it gets a little bit messy with the grid and the guides turned on, but I'll take my content area, free transform it, and it also needs to come back and snap to its position. All right, so let's free transform that, and that's looking correct finally. I'll take this guide and get rid of it. I can just drag that off back to the ruler, and I'll turn off the guides for just a second, and I'll turn off this grid for just a second so I can see what I'm working with again. And that looks correct. I need to delete this last column there in my guides layer because I didn't need that one, which is the very last shape there. So I'll just take that layer and delete that layer. Yes, and minimize that folder again. And let's make sure that we're set up here correct. So it looks like 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I need to fix these inside shapes. In fact, I'm going to turn off the featured images while I do these inside lines. So I'll take my content div, and it needs to come back one more tick. Now it's a little bit easier to see. I can see exactly where it needs to go. And the sidebar div needs to come over to and snap to that edge. And now we're set up correctly at the correct size. So now I can take essentially all of the layers that make up, because now I'm not centered in my document, I'm one column shy. I need to center everything back up. So we can view the grid here and bring everything over into place. So let's grab we're gonna grab the layer 1, the wireframe blocks, and the guides. I'll zoom out a little bit. Hit V to move those. Hold down Shift so we can move them all over an equal length. And they need to come, I believe, right there as center. So now if we zoom in here, we can count these main grid blocks. It's kind of hard to see with that dark background color. We'll turn that off. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 and a half. And over here, we're at 1, 2, 3, 4 and a half. So now that's perfectly centered. So we can turn that back on, turn back off the guide, and now we can readjust some of these layers. Like I need to readjust the shadow up there because that's being cut off. So I can come over here and pull that back over to the edge. And now we're at the correct size. So kind of a silly mistake there. I didn't count those at the beginning, but at least you can see how you can easily fix that. At least I caught that early in the process. Otherwise, we would have had to do quite a bit more work to fix that. So I'll turn off the guides now. And now we're back to here. We can work on the featured slider. So we'll zoom back in here. And I'm going to turn back on my featured images. And you can see that they're all now roughly the correct size of that box. They don't need to be exactly the same size. They can be bigger because we're actually going to add a mask onto these images here in just a minute. But as long as they're about the size of your content, you're good to go. So we're going to build our little featured slider box. So I'm going to turn these off for just a second. And I'm going to use this top box as a reference here because they're all going to fit inside of this featured slider. So I'll open my wireframe blocks and I'll make sure that this top box is the exact size that I want it. And at this point, you do want to decide how tall do you want that featured box. I'm just going to leave mine at the 430 pixels, which we created at the beginning. But if you know a specific size, you may want to readjust that height or readjust the height of these two columns accordingly. All right, in the ending design here, you'll notice that this featured slider has somewhat of a shadow that comes out, and it kind of lifts the slider off the page a little bit. It gives it a feeling of depth, and we're going to recreate that effect next. So there's a couple of ways to do this, and I'll show you kind of a neat little trick to do it, or a method that I've come up with that works well for me. Now, the first thing we're going to do is come over and get our shape tool. I can find it right down there. And we're going to grab and drag out a shape, the same width as this box, which will be about the width of our little shadow. So we'll just drag out a box like so. And we want to make the box actually black. So set the color to black. You may want to change it to black before you actually create it. And once we've set this shape to black, we're going to add an anchor point right in the middle of this design. Now, an easy way to get the middle point of a document is to select the background layer, because the background layer is the full width of the document, and drag out a guide, and it will snap right when it hits the middle point of your document. So right there you can see 700 pixels is the midpoint. So I can just drop a guide there and I know that that's the middle. Now I'm going to zoom in here and add an anchor point on this vector shape. So I'm going to select my pen tool and come over to the add anchor point, and I'm going to add one right there. It doesn't need to be exactly perfect, but we'll try to make it pixel perfect right in the middle. If you have a good eye, I suppose you could eyeball it. Once we have that anchor point set up, we're creating what I call a bow tie shape, and we're going to want to go get our white arrow tool. The white arrow tool in Photoshop lets us work with individual anchor points rather than the entire vector shape. So you can just deselect and make sure you just select just that one anchor. Let's zoom in so we can get right on it. Once you select the individual anchor point, then, whoops, I don't actually have it selected. Let's see if that is. Okay, that looks like it's selected now. Nope. I have all of those selected. So I'm going to deselect and then reselect on there. Make sure that one's a solid black color and these other four should be open or white squares. So now that I just have the one, I can use my up arrow to nudge this shape up. And I don't want, well, I guess it doesn't technically matter, but this kind of has this little curl to it, which you may or may not want, but we'll leave it on for now. And so I'm just going to pull this up a little bit so that the ends down here obviously extend past the middle. And I'll consider that good. Let's deselect and take a look. So that's looking okay. Now what I want to do is I want to take that shape that I've just created and I want to add a blur effect to it. So I want to blur this entire shape out. Now because this is a vector object, I can't blur a vector shape. So one, I either need to rasterize it and flatten that layer and turn it into a bitmap layer, or I can create a smart object of the layer and use a smart filter. I'm going to opt for the latter because it gives me a little bit more control and I can make mistakes and correct them. So let's select that layer that what we're working with here. And it's called Rectangle 2. I'm just going to rename this layer and call it Shadow. Or I'll call it Featured Shadow. And we're going to right click the entire layer and say Convert to Smart Object. And this will take that layer and put it into a smart object format. You'll see the icon right here changes and shows this little square that indicates this layer is now a smart object. Once it's a smart object layer, I can apply smart filters. Now, if I go to the filter menu and come down to the blur and add, I'm just going to add a Gaussian blur here to show you how this works. So we'll add a Gaussian blur. Let me scroll down here. You can just click and drag to come down into this area. You can see the amount of blur is affected by the radius value here. Now the benefit of using a smart filter instead of flattening the layer is that if I hit OK and apply that, I can turn off that effect. And if I want to edit the effect, I can simply double click it and bring back up that smart and change the radius value. If it was a flattened layer, it's a destructive effect. So once I do it, I can't edit it. And so this is a little bit better way of working. So you'll just want to play around with the radius value here of your blurred object until you blur out those edges a little bit so they're not quite so stiff. So this looks about good for me, maybe 3.5 pixels of radius value. And I'll hit OK. And again, the benefit, we can change this later. Now, once I've done that, I'm going to apply a mask to this smart object and gradually fade out the shadow. And this is going to create what we call fall off. If you look at a shadow, the farther it gets away from the object that's casting the shadow, the less intense the shadow gets. So it has this fall off. And the shadow is the deepest black when it's right up close to the object. And so we're going to kind of create this illusion of fall off as well in our shadow. So we need to add a layer mask to this featured shadow layer. Now down in your layers panel, this icon right here kind of looks like a camera. That's the layer mask icon. So we're going to select that, and by default it adds a white mask to your layer, and now we can mask this out. So again, when you're masking, I'll just quickly cover this again with the brush tool. If I get a brush, make sure that you're on the correct layer. Once you add a layer mask, if you have this highlighted, you can't mask. You need to make sure you have your mask highlighted. And with the brush tool, If I brush with black, it's going to erase the pixels, and if I brush with white, it reveals. So you can kind of think white reveal, black conceal. That's a little acronym that sometimes helps you remember if you get confused between those. And any level of gray, so I'll switch this, instead of having black, I'll switch it to gray. Gray is going to do a semi-transparency. You can see that gray is semi-transparent. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to mask this out with a gradient going from black and white. So it's going to gradually fade this out as it falls off towards the outer edges. So we're going to use a gradient tool, and we're also going to leverage the reflection capability of our gradients up here. So this middle gradient is the reflected gradient. Sorry, it's the 1, 2, 3, 4th tick over. And this will essentially, if I pull a gradient this way, it reflects it on this half of wherever I pull as well. And so that's what this gradient does. Now I'm going to want my colors for the gradient to be black and white. So set black and white as your foreground and background colors. And then select the gradient tool, click on the gradient editor up in the top left, and you'll want to make sure to select the second preset, which is foreground to transparent. So select that preset, and you can see that that builds a gradient that goes from black to white for my color stops, and my opacity stops are 100% to 0%. So it's basically going to transparent, but the colors still are from black to white, or foreground to transparent rather. All right, once I have that gradient set, whoops, I told you the wrong gradient. Sorry, not this first click, it's not the second preset, it's the first preset. I don't want a transparent gradient here, I just want black to white, and 100% to 100%. Because we're working in a mask, we want 100% values of this gradient. So once we have the first preset, black and white, we can create this gradient. So what we're going to want to do is come to that midpoint line we created earlier, and just come down here anywhere and click, and then hold down shift and drag out to one side. So you're just going to kind of drag all the way out to here and let go. Now you can see right off the bat, the issue here is that my colors are backwards. I need my background color to be black and my foreground to be white. So I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that. And this little option here will switch them, or you can press X to switch those. And then let's try that again. So I'll click right here in the midpoint, hold down shift, and come out here to the left and let go. And you can see that just makes this gradient slightly fall off as it gets to the outer edge. Now mine falls off, I think, a little bit too fast. So I'm going to undo that and start in the middle again, and I'm going to extend past the edge. So I'm going to come clear out here, maybe 100 pixels past, and then let go. And that makes it fall out a little bit more. Now the next step is just to move this layer and nudge this layer, which is our featured slider layer, our shadow here, up underneath that box. So we gotta take this featured shadow and we're just gonna nudge it with the arrow keys up just a couple of pixels so that it looks like it's coming from underneath. And then we need to, I'm gonna minimize or maximize this and drag that layer down underneath the featured box. And then you can kind of see that effect come to life to where it looks like those edges are curling up ever so slightly off the edge of the page. And you can just nudge this up and down. If you want less curl, you can bring it all the way up there just for a little bit of curl on the edges, or nudge it down if you want that curl to be quite intense with a bigger shadow. So play around with those, nudge it up and down to get something that works for you. So I'll just leave mine about right there. And now we have that shadow. Now the next thing we need to do is to get our featured images. We're going to turn these on, and we want our featured images folder. Remember, this folder has all these featured images that you're going to want to rotate eventually on your site. I just have several of them inside of this folder. And we want to create a mask on this folder so that it cuts them and masks them exactly to the layer bounds of our featured layer. So in order to do that, I'm going to hide this layer. We can hold down the Command key and click on the thumbnail icon to bring up margin ants around that layer's bounds. Basically what that does is it selects all non-transparent pixels inside of the featured layer in this instance. And then I can come up, I have a selection around the area I need. I can come up to the featured images layer, which is a group that has all my images inside of it, come down and create a layer mask. So I'll select the layer mask icon, And you can see that masks out everything but that area. So now when I turn this on, it clips those layers right to the bounds they need to be on. And I can just toggle in between these layers quite easily. And then it makes it a little bit easier to adjust them. So I can kind of take this and I can maybe say, pull this layer up and down, turn off auto select. I had that turned on. I can nudge this layer up and down. You can see, you know, you can play around with maybe where you want to position this inside of your slider if the image is bigger than your box here for your featured slider. So that's pretty much it for the featured slider box. Nothing too tricky inside of there. I'm going to turn this same image on for the main portion here. And we've got the shadow built down there for our slider. And now we can move on to designing the other assets. And the next portion will be some of the header sections.